This week's Downtown Zen Politics podcast is somewhat of an unusual one because as we just sat down to record, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced his resignation. So we'll be having a quick reflection on that, as well as looking back on that phenomenal result for Andy Burnham in the Makerfield by-election, and also the first Conservative by-election victory in 50 years. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
It worked.
So momentous day, yet another Prime Minister bites the dust in UK politics, and here to discuss that with me, as ever, on the Downtown Den Politics podcast is Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. So we've literally just heard, the Prime Minister's resignation statement from the steps of Downing Street, and it's becoming a regular occurrence, isn't it? We've now gone through 7 Prime Ministers since that Brexit vote, which of course was 10 years ago, almost to the day. And James, come to you first. What did you make, first of all, expected, I guess, after last week's tumultuous result in the Makerfield by-election, which we'll come to a little later on. But I think a Prime Minister there that is clearly not going because he wants to, but going because he's being pushed.
Yes, one obviously has to acknowledge the sort of human side of this, and by the end his voice was cracking just like Theresa May's voice cracked. We've got to realise that these people have put everything into it. They have the top job in the country, and whatever comes thereafter is going to be a shadow of its former self. Obviously, one doesn't want to be unkind, but I did query all this. I have achieved this, I have achieved that. I think my government have achieved would have probably been a bit better, but he clearly feels very angry that he's listed all those achievements, and there is some validity in it. There are some signs of economic recovery and prices coming down, and some of the immigration being controlled. There are good news stories, but there's problems not being able to convey that. So he obviously is now going to do an orderly transition, but perhaps we'll come on to what's going to happen next later on. But, a decent man, an honourable man, but he was both unable to communicate a vision, and I don't think actually had a vision for the country that he could actually encapsulate. So, as some commentators have been saying over the weekend, he was asking for sort of loyalty and for the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Party, to follow him. But they were sort of saying, in which direction are we going? It was all piecemeal stuff. There wasn't a theme.
Yeah, and I think that was the problem throughout his premiership, wasn't it? From the time he took office on the 4th of July 2024, he struggled to communicate a plan, a vision, a strategy. And the original sin, I suppose, which he never really recovered from, this government have never recovered from, was the winter fuel allowance. And of course, he got embroiled very early on in his premiership with this free suits and specs scandal, which didn't go down particularly well as far as an electorate was concerned, that was sick and tired of the Tory sleaze that had gone before it. And the one thing you claim there, Joe, that I think most Labour MPs would be cheering to the rafters over the past 2 years was the lifting of the 2-child benefit cap. But again, we have to remind ourselves that was another U-turn by the Prime Minister, because actually he and Rachel Reeves had initially said that there wasn't going to be a change in that policy. And I think if there's anything that defines Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister, it is his inability to stick to almost anything. There's been U-turn after U-turn, not being convincing at all in respect of what he was laying out as a vision and a plan, as I say. And I think this resignation was inevitable, whether it happened now or whether it happened sometime in the not too distant future, I don't think there was ever any doubt that he would not be Labour's leader going into the next general election. I think what we found, Joe, was that perhaps people can lead political parties. That does not necessarily mean you're going to make a good prime minister and be able to lead the country.
No, absolutely. And I think, what happened was he changed the Labour Party for the better, and he's quite right to take credit for getting rid of anti-Semitism within the party. But he came into government with absolutely no plan, no strategy, and this inability to communicate with his MPs or the general public. It's astonishing, really, the absolute visceral hatred that people have for Keir Starmer, who is a man who is so bland. It's like hating rice pudding, which of course a lot of people do. But there is that sort of, you can't feel the same vitriol about him as you could about Liz Truss or Boris Johnson or Thatcher, for instance. And you're right, Frank. I mean, you end up doing U-turns, sometimes quite rightly because new evidence or something else has changed your mind. But he's gone into these things without stopping to think, like the impact of the increase in the minimum wage and national insurance for employers, which has absolutely crucified small businesses, as you know better than any of us. So he's made some terrible mistakes. He's had terrible advisors around him. Jim's right. I mean, it is a personal tragedy in a way, because everybody puts everything into it, and however dreadful they are at the job, their family have paid a huge price for the last couple of years, and he must have had a ghastly weekend. I think what's interesting is that he said, full and unequivocal support for his successor. He also, in a way, echoed Gordon Brown by saying he was going to concentrate on the most important job being a husband and a father, which suggests that he doesn't see a return, perhaps as Foreign Secretary, which some people have suggested under a potential Andy Burnham government. Yeah,
and I think the more I thought about that, the more I felt we were into the realms of fantasy politics, because it's very difficult for a prime minister to go into another cabinet role immediately. You can't rule out a future return in the way that Cameron sort of went away and came back, but an immediate changeover like that I thought was highly unlikely. I also just
or after Balfour, of course, in the early part of the 20th century. I remember.
Of course, Jim, you reported on that. We'll get the joke in early this weekend. Yeah, I mean, I take the points that both of you make in respect of, it's always sad to see somebody having to fall on the sword, and obviously getting very emotional towards the end of his resignation speech there on the steps of Downing Street, as many of them do, of course. But as I say, I think we've got to reflect on 2 years of missed opportunities and a wasted opportunity on the back of what was a decent victory, but only 33% of the electorate voted for a Labour government. There was a need for some urgency, some genuine bold change in the approach to which we took government in this country. And I don't think he ever got to grips with that. And we can talk about the foreign affairs international stage in which Starmer, to an extent, thrived, although his relationship with Donald Trump was starting to unravel pretty quickly over the past couple of months since the Iran conflict started. But I think, the point I made there, he was out of his depth, wasn't he? Because let's take those early decisions that he took, or he didn't take, actually. The Chancellor basically was delegated almost whole responsibility for the economic direction of the country. So I've mentioned Winter Food Allowance, which has never been forgiven by many, many people. It was a poorly thought through policy. Remember the grooming gangs scandal in the early days of this Parliament, where again, he immediately ruled out a national inquiry, and then about 6 or 7 weeks later was forced into a U-turn on that. The sacking of Louise Haigh, who ironically has now been the mastermind of Burnham's return to Parliament, not just through that by-election in Makerfield and her involvement in that, but I understand some of the work that she's been doing behind the scenes in terms of the Parliamentary Labour Party liaison on behalf of Andy Burnham. And we said at the time it seemed a very strange, bit of a daft thing to sack her for. You know, it was an issue that he was aware of prior to appointing her as the Transport Secretary. So either don't appoint her, but certainly don't put her into office and then sack her. And of course, the biggest thing, and I think the final nail in his coffin, was the Mandelson affair. How can you delegate such a huge decision, such as the ambassador to the United States, the most important ambassadorial role that the UK has and the Prime Minister gives, and he's delegated that to Morgan McSweeney. So this litany, I think, of evidence against Keir Starmer was simply building and building. And with or without Andy Burnham, my feeling, Jim, was he had to go anyway.
Yeah, a real missed opportunity. I mean, we've talked on innumerable occasions about the major problem was the tax straitjacket into which Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves put themselves. I think that was a major mistake. As I've said repeatedly in the past, you know, if they'd actually said they'd put a penny on income tax, but this is what we're going to do, they would have still have won, not with such a big majority, but they would still have won. I know why they didn't, because they'd lost all these elections and so on. But that was the framing of it. And beyond that, and that in a sense informed, but not completely explained, with a majority of that size. Take elderly care, for instance. With a majority of that size for 5 years, you had every opportunity to deal with what is not going to go away as a major social issue in this country. And they would have had the majority to have reformed all that. What did they do? They set up another inquiry. We had the Dilnot report about 15 years ago. We didn't need another inquiry, but that sort of symbolised it. You know, there are other things, welfare reform, House of Lords reform, all this sort of things, all opportunities missed. Just one last thing, just to go back to what Joe was saying, reflecting on the level of hate for Sir Keir Starmer, who in a sense didn't have the personality to attract that sort of thing. I mean, you could hate Boris Johnson or like him, or you hate Donald Trump because there's something to push against, but there wasn't with Sir Keir. And I think on reflection, it's that people are just generally pretty angry about things. And he became a lightning rod because he's a prime minister. I think that can be the only explanation for the level of hatred that there was. And of course, some people have said in a slightly anti-Andy Burnham comment that the people of Makerfield in May voted to remove Sir Keir Starmer through the local elections, and in June voted again to remove Sir Keir Starmer through the vehicle of Andy Burnham. It should be just a slight cautionary note to Andy, because we haven't actually mentioned the fact that he won that by-election with a much bigger majority than I thought.
Well, we're going to come to that later,
okay,
James.
sorry.
As I said, we'll come on to the Makerfield by-election. Let's just stick with Keir Starmer for a moment. You've added to the list of things that the Keir Starmer's government got wrong, such as the welfare rights reform, or welfare benefits reform, rather, that he didn't manage to get through. Joe, you've mentioned the impact on business in terms of national minimum wage, national insurance. There's also an employment rights bill that is coming forward that an awful lot of employees are unhappy about. And I think this visceral hatred, which I've never understood of Keir Starmer, is maybe something we're going to have to attach to all prime ministers moving forward, because it seems to me that everybody who goes into number 10 almost starts with a minus. And as I say, we're going to discuss Andy Burnham and Makerfield in a moment, and some interesting poll readings come in as a result of that particular victory for Andy Burnham. But let's just finally wrap up this section of the podcast in terms of Keir Starmer and his time in office. And what I'd say, Joe, is he is, as with all of these people, other than Liz Truss, I guess, and Boris Johnson to an extent, often we look back and history treats them kinder than the immediate. And what I would say about Keir Starmer is I still think he's a decent guy and he was in it for the right reasons. I also think that we need to remember that he took over a Labour Party that was in the gutter, actually, when he was elected as leader 6 years ago, and transformed the party to an extent. What I would say as a caveat to that is he was dealt a really great hand by the Conservative government at the time, Johnson, Truss, and ultimately Rishi Sunak. But nonetheless, I think, Joe, ultimately he will be remembered as the guy who was elected and showed himself to be out of his depth.
Yeah, I think so. And that's a shame on a personal level, because as you say, Frank, I think he is probably a decent man. But I'm afraid the idea that he was decent went out of the window with that early thing of the free glasses and the dodgy suits and things. And I think, many people thought he was going to be the Clement Attlee, after the Poundland Boris Johnson's Churchill thing. And he didn't have that because he didn't have a plan. And I mean, yes, he's got credit for some things, as you've just said. I think he should get some credit for stabilizing Britain's position internationally initially. But there's another place where he was very, very weak. He wouldn't come out and say what he felt about Europe. There was a lot of fawning around Donald Trump, which actually, as we know, dealing with a 2-year-old doesn't make any difference because they've forgotten it and they've moved on to hate the next person. So I don't think he's going to be remembered like other people as, oh, what a shame, the best prime minister, we should have given him a chance. And I think this is a warning to Andy Burnham, always streeting. You've got to come in. I mean, in a way, it's what Tony Blair argued in his essay a couple of weeks ago. You can come in and you can win an election, but unless you've got a plan and it's policy, not slogans, and it's getting the parliamentary party behind, whoever takes over now has got to say, right, we are going to reform welfare. We are going to spend money on defence. We are going to put up taxes, whatever we're going to do. But if we don't do it our way, the next lot will do it in a worse way, and Labour will be out of power for a generation at least.
Absolutely. And just final point from me, and just relates to something that you were saying there about Joe, about on the international stage. And yes, he did restore the UK's reputation to an extent. But then when it came to the big issue of defence and security, his defence minister resigned because he didn't act. So he was saying the right things, but he actually wasn't taking the actions that were required to boost that defence spending. So, listen, he's gone. It was expected, I think, by everyone following that result on Thursday in Makerfield. And after the break, we're going to turn our attentions to that result, what it means for Labour, for reform, for the Conservatives, perhaps, who had their own decent result in Aberdeen, of all places, in a by-election too. And we'll be having a look at the potential runners and riders in a maybe Labour leadership contest. Stay with us, we'll be back in a sec. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. So we'll just have a little reflection on that result that happened by election on Thursday in Makerfield. It's been well trailed now, of course, well discussed, but I think despite the fact that many of us thought Andy Burnham would get over the line, the scale of his result was stunning in one sense. A 9,000 majority, 55% near enough of the entire poll, an increase in turnout since the general election. That's almost unheard of in by-elections, and that then set this trail of events which has led this morning to Keir Starmer resigning as Prime Minister. I don't want to talk too much about Andy Burnham until we get onto the leadership contest or potential leadership contest, Joe, but clearly it was a great result for him and testament to his personal brand in Greater Manchester. But I wanted to ask you about what you felt the impact on reform would be. Nigel Farage had obviously come up with the line before the defeat was announced, that he was going to blame Restore. But even with Restore's vote, they get nowhere near Andy Burnham. And what did appear to be the case in Makerfield was that Tories and Liberal Democrats were quite happy to lend their vote, in this case to the Labour candidate. And it's almost anyone but Nigel, anyone but Reform. That will be a big concern to him, won't it?
Well, it certainly should be. And, you know, this is another example of another absolute dud candidate. You know, if you remember Gorton and Denton, they put in, you know, the academic right-wing lunatic Matt Goodwin, who was completely and utterly useless. And then here we had Rob Kenyon. And there's been some really interesting articles actually over the weekend, sort of analysis on this, that if Reform think it's okay to put a bloke up who said the most disgusting sexist things and then, you know, bat it away, oh, it's a bit of banter, he's just a lad, he's a working class bloke, that's what blokes do. Well, you're going to alienate 50% of your potential voters. And interestingly, I think they've already picked a man who I don't know for the mayoral election in Manchester. So Reform ought to do a bit of soul searching. You know, they're picking duff candidates. This is 2 by-elections that they've lost. They lost absolutely comprehensively to Labour. You know, and everybody was saying beforehand, oh, it's neck and neck, it's neck and neck. And as you say, Frank, you know, even if you put Reform and Restore votes together, they still wouldn't have beaten Andy Burnham. And I think this tactical voting, you know, which you didn't mention the Greens, who I think also lent their votes as well. And, you know, they arguably are on a high and they've got a lot more to go for. So, you know, is this going to see a greater call and a promise of PR? But if you think it is only 40 something days since Reform won all those council elections, well, that's a huge change. And that huge turnout is an indication of, you know, we've been talking about the visceral hatred of Keir Starmer. There is a visceral hatred of Reform. So I just wonder whether they have peaked. I mean, they're still doing well in the polls, but, you know, you hear anecdotally and really how chaotic they are in local government. And, you know, this might be the shine is coming off.
Yeah. And as Joe's just indicated there, from 6 weeks ago when Reform almost swept the board entirely in Wigan, the council in which Makerfield sits in terms of its boundary, Andy Burnham achieved a 20+% swing back to Labour from Reform, Jim. And what Andy Burnham and his supporters are now saying as we enter this period of potential leadership contest, maybe a coronation, we will wait and see. They are saying Andy Burnham is the antidote to Reform.
Yes, possibly. I don't want to rain on Andy's parade at all, but I mean, in retrospect, it was almost a perfect seat for him to fight next door to Lee. He was a local candidate as well, so that quashed all that stuff about he's using it as a springboard to get to number 10 Downing Street. And as you said, in fairness, some weeks ago, the quality of the Reform UK candidate was very poor. I said at the time, people are so angry they won't care. Maybe they do care a bit about people who are misogynists and that sort of thing. And there's going to be a lot of soul searching about candidate selection as far as Reform's concerned. I mean, that begs the question of whether they've got people who got the ability to pass the sniff test. I mean, a lot of them won't have, but it is a big issue for them. So, you know, and to some extent, the posters were all about Andy and not the Labour Party, and obviously Sir Keir Starmer wasn't anywhere. So, in a sense, it was the perfect seat for Andy. And you know, the big question.
Can you translate that to the national electorate is the question, Jim, isn't it?
Yeah. You know, and there's going to be more and more analysis of what Manchesterism is. I mean, for instance, you know, Andy's talking about, you know, engineering jobs and how manufacturing and that sort of thing's really important, and sort of implying that Manchesterism means that, Well, as somebody pointed out at the weekend, the revival of Manchester has largely been on the back of residential buildings, financial services, very high tech jobs, that sort of thing, not the sort of the earthy jobs that sometimes Andy conjures up. So his record's going to be examined more, and crucially, of course, what he's going to do next. So I don't know whether we want to move on to this now, but there's this rather curious thing that Andy now needs time, time to think about the job and all that sort of thing, and whether he'll get time or not will depend. Because my reading of it is that July the 9th, if nobody else steps forward, he'll have to take up the reins immediately. I can't imagine Sir Keir Starmer saying, right, well, no one else has stood, Andy. Now I'm going to hang around all over the summer for you to get used to the job. But he may regard that as part of his honourable thing. But it'd be a bit awkward, wouldn't it?
I think that is just, again, a bit of a fantasy in terms of the political realities of life. You can't have a prime minister in situ who's not in charge. So the idea that we can go through July, August, and most of September before we get to the Labour Party conference, and then have this huge coronation of Andy Burnham, is for the birds, in my opinion. 9th of July, and it will either be a contest, at which point my guess would be that Keir Starmer would still want to go and maybe put a caretaker Prime Minister in charge, someone like Pat McFadden, whilst that leadership contest took place. Why would you want to put yourself and your family through any longer a period of time in 10 Downing Street if you've announced that sort of 9th of July and I'm off? So he will have to have a plan by then, whether he likes it or not, if he is going to, as I say, be coronated, if that's even a word. But I do wonder, Joe, there is the two school of thought here, isn't there? One is, look, the country is fed up with the psychodrama of political contests, the internal warfare within political parties. And so the best thing for the country, and indeed for the government, would be a quick transition over to Burnham, and then he gets his team in place and government continues. But what Wes Street, to an extent, I think Tony Blair in his essay a couple of weeks ago, and others are saying, is no, we've got to have a contest for two reasons. Firstly, let's see what you're made of. Are you capable of scrutiny and intense pressure? And secondly, what are your ideas anyway? What are you going to do that's differently to what the government have done so far? Where do you sit on that?
Well, interestingly, we discussed this last week with Martin when you were not with us, and he and I are of the view that actually it would be far better to take some time, because just changing the face at the top, when you've got a public who expect everything to happen yesterday, and they want, click and collect policies, they want instant gratification, they want all of that stuff, and it ain't going to happen. And he cannot afford, whoever it is, whether it's Wes Streeting or Andy Burnham or Angela Rayner or whoever, you can't afford to get it wrong, because the public will not put up with it. So you've got to go in and be really clear that you've got to get your parliamentary party right behind you. You've got to get your cabinet secretary, presuming that Antonio Romeo stays. You've got to get your cabinet in place, and you've got to outline what your clear priorities are and get on with them, because it's going to be a very, very short honeymoon period. And if it is a coronation, there will be calls for a general election, which would be disastrous, but you can absolutely understand why people would have that argument, particularly if it is going to somebody who wasn't even an MP at the last general election. So, there's all of that to consider. And I think, if there is a way of saying, I will take over in September, I am now going to spend the summer, well, you could have David Lammy as acting Deputy Prime Minister over the summer, but that's a rather dismal prospect. Or, does Keir Starmer say, he did allude to his successor being in place by September. I don't know what else is coming up, G7s or anything like that imminently, but it's very difficult to see how you can be a prime minister and take decisions.
It just does. I mean, how are you going to go onto these? Can you imagine the personal humiliation
Well, yeah,
of
exactly.
having to stand there knowing that you are the dead duck prime minister? It's just not good. Surely it's not going to happen. If there's anything, the one thing I would say about Keir Starmer is he's a proud man. So if I'm putting myself in that position, there is no way in a million years that I am going beyond the 9th of July, I'm afraid. And whether Andy Burnham, the Labour Party, or anyone else wants me to stay on, well, you know, the point I'd be making to those guys is, well, you've basically you've undertaken a coup. If you're not now ready to take over, that ain't my fault. You're the guys that have pushed this as hard as you could to get me out. And so if you're not ready, well, more fool you. So for me, Joe, I think the question isn't whether Keir stays until September. I will be amazed if that happens.
No, I don't think he will, for the reasons you've outlined. And I think, you know, he's got no authority. And actually,
but just for the record, I think this idea that McFadden would stand in. You have the 8th prime minister in 10 years. I think Keir would stay on. You know, the 9th of July is not the date on which, as I understand it, Keir Starmer said he's going to cease to be prime minister. It's the close of nominations for the Labour Party leader.
Yeah. So he's.
I just don't see it, Jim. I think that most likely scenario will be that Andy Burnham is basically fast tracked into 10 Downing Street. And he'll be in there before the summer recess potentially. And then it gives him the August period and that period of time when they're out of Parliament to put his team. He'll have his team in place now, sure. I mean, again, I'd have to say, if he hasn't, then fucking hell, we should be worried about Andy Burnham because there's another prime minister coming in without a plan.
Well, I haven't heard the names of the people around him.
Well, how would you know? But at the end of the day, Jim, come on, he's not going to be on the phone to journalists saying, well, here's my cabinet, here's my team.
No,
I'm
talking
not going
about
to be that presumptuous. They were very cautious about even saying they won Makerfield, and we know how handily they won that. So let me just put this point to you. I think that Burnham will be, I don't think that the Labour Party has the appetite for a leadership contest. The Parliamentary Labour Party appears to me that they want to get on with things. The majority of them are clearly supporting Andy Burnham, in which case, if Wes Streeting did decide to throw his hat in the ring, then he's already on the back foot because he got a parliamentary party that are going to be against him, even if he did manage to convince somehow a membership that at this moment in time is saying he's more unpopular than Keir Starmer with them. So I just think that you've got to have a reality check here. And the reality check says to me, in the politics of the 21st century, whereas Joe says you don't have people sitting back and being patient, there will be so much pressure on Burnham and others who may be standing that I think it's going to be a coronation. I think he's going to be in by July.
Yeah, I think you're probably right that Wes Streeting's decision not to go for it, if that is the decision, is because of the size of the majority in Makerfield. If Andy had just scraped in, I think Wes. So I think, and then it begs the question: what job for Wes, and what sort of people, and also the vital role of Chancellor, over which there's a huge debate. You know, the trade unions saying they don't want Ed Miliband and all that sort of thing. But the position of Chancellor,
only Ed Miliband. Once Ed Miliband.
I think we're agreed that Rachel Reeves will go. Is that?
Yeah,
do we think that?
She's got to, because it's part of the change agenda, isn't it?
Well, she's part of the problem.
Correct. Yeah, I agree, Joe. I think, listen, we can come back to this, but for me, I think Burnham will already have his team set. He probably he will have had conversations with Wes Streeting, undoubtedly. You know, the idea that they're a million miles away politically either. I think Andy Burnham is most likely to let down who? The left of the Labour Party. And the question that we will need to be asking of Andy is whether he can get those key appointments around him right. That was the biggest problem Keir Starmer had. Even if Keir Starmer himself didn't have a plan, he could have potentially got people into the room who did have a plan, who could navigate their way through government, who could actually have made a better fist of governing the country than Keir Starmer was able to do. And what Andy Burnham has to do is create that team around him. And crucially, and this is where my sort of question mark over Andy will come, can you have people in that room who are going to robustly disagree with you from time to time? Because that, I think, is something that Andy and any Prime Minister actually needs. And we'll see who and how this sort of thing starts to happen over the next few days. But for me, Jim, I think he'll be in post pretty quickly.
Yes, I mean, you can't. I mean, if we're ruling Wes Streeting out, you can't rule out someone like Clive Lewis, sort of because of this anxiety on the left. Because
Clive Lewis is supporting Andy Burnham.
Okay, well,
Clive Lewis actually said he'd resign his seat in order for Andy Burnham.
Well, let's knock them off. Al Carnes.
Oh, come on! What's he going to do? Show him? Well, I can do more press ups than you, Andy.
Angela Rayner.
No, Angela's going to support Andy.
Right, well, in that case, on July the 9th, Andy Burnham.
The only one I could see potentially emerge if they're determined to have a contest, and as I say, I'm not sure the party has the appetite for that, would be Darren Jones.
I have a lot of time for Darren Jones, actually. He's not everyone's cup of tea, but he's a very intelligent man. Yeah,
I think it's too soon. So, listen, we will see. Let's very quickly. Tory by-election win in Aberdeen, and this all seems to be around drill, baby, drill.
Yeah.
Joe, the people of Aberdeen fed up that all those great jobs are being lost because Ed Miliband is obsessed with net zero. Net zero is fine, but actually he's also obsessed with killing the oil and gas industry at a time when, if you want to build data centers and you want to do all that great work around sustainable energy and net zero, then what do you need? Oil and gas. So the trade unions, as Jim has indicated, are a bit fed up with Ed's approach to that agenda, and so too it seems are the people of Aberdeen. A kick in the what's it for the SNP as well, Jim?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the first by-election victory for the Tories in 50 years. I mean,
Wow.
Jim was obviously a veteran reporter then.
Glasgow Pollock, I remember it well. Second joke.
And Kemi Badenoch, paid 3 visits up there to Aberdeen. She had a very clear message. She went in there, and everything that you've just said, Frank, is part of the problem with this outgoing Keir Starmer government. We're so wedded to this, we can't see the impact. We're so wedded to minimum wage, we can't see, it's not going to it's going to lose jobs. We're so wedded to X, we're going to destroy Aberdeen. So a good result for the Tories. I think over the last few weeks, Kemi Badenoch has found her pace much more. She's much more confident. She is punching probably about where she ought to be. And I think, we do need a robust and decent opposition that is not reform. So, I welcome that, although I would not be voting Tory anytime soon. But I do think it's important that we do have a good, and if she can get the Tories back on track to be a bit more middle of the road and a little bit, so that, you see, the other thing I think about reform is a lot of people don't like the fact that reform is now the Tory tribute band with Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman. So interesting times ahead. I would imagine that both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage will be thinking, oh, bugger, Prime Minister's questions are not going to be so easy in the future.
And Jim, just on the broader point of Kemi Badenoch and how she reacts to that Makerfield result, because of course the Tories lost their deposit, but nonetheless they've won that Aberdeen seat. And what we've all said this morning is that the shine does look as though it's coming off reform a little. And there is a feeling within the country that if you've got to vote to keep Farage out, let's keep Farage out. So maybe Kemi Badenoch will be thinking to herself, let's stop aping the reform line let's try to create this centre-right political party that has been so successful over the past century and a bit.
Well, yesterday's Mail on Sunday, their lead story was her absolutely ruling it out. You know, there's been this Rees-Mogg going on and on and on about uniting the right, but she couldn't have been clearer. Now, as we've seen, I mean, on Friday morning after Makerfield, Sir Keir Starmer was saying he would contest any election, so politicians can change their minds. We know that. But as far as one can see, the personal bitterness and, to be fair, the ideological differences between the Conservative Party and Reform are very great, and they're not going to be coming together. I mean, as far as Aberdeen South was concerned, you know, in one sense, it was an absolute by-election classic of opportunism. You know, the Conservatives identified the anxiety over the oil and gas industry and went into one particular seat where it was very resonant and secured a victory. So let's see how they perform elsewhere, because it still remains the truth that although Kemi Badenoch's ratings are improving, she's well ahead of her party, who are still not delivering. They went backwards in the local elections. So she's still got a lot to do to haul her party up, but she definitely is improving her game.
Well, the final point I will make on polls is that going into the by-election in Makerfield, Andy Burnham, as we know, was Labour's most retail-friendly politician. All the polls told us how popular he was, and he still remains in those ratings, you know, with a net plus poll rating. But how many points do you think he's gone up or down by since that by-election started? Jim? Up or down?
Andy Burnham's ratings?
Since the by-election started to when it finished.
Oh, well, or do you mean since the by-election?
Yeah. Now?
Yeah. Well,
where does he stand now?
I should think it's gone down a little bit.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I think it's probably gone down a bit.
15 points down.
Yeah.
In 6 weeks. And herein lies the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you like Andy Burnham? When he's mayor of Greater Manchester, I'm a Conservative voter. Yeah, he's all right, Andy. He's a good lad. Andy Burnham can now become Prime Minister, leading the Labour Party. What do you think of him now? No, actually, I'm not that much a fan of his. Yeah. And the reason I make that point is that changing the leader does not necessarily mean you're going to move the dial that much on where people's opinions are at the moment. I think Andy Burnham has many qualities. I think he's got one or two things going for him, not least the fact that he's an insurgent and he's coming from outside of that Westminster bubble. But I think the challenges that he faces, the complexities of trying to navigate a parliamentary Labour Party that has lost all discipline and does not have a compass in which to follow, he's got to sort that out very, very quickly. He's got to get that strong team around him. And most importantly, he's got to try and basically communicate better what the Labour government is going to achieve in a very tight framework of what it promised in a manifesto. Because if he tries to be too bold and go way beyond that manifesto and the manifesto commitments that were made, then those calls for the general election from an already vitriolic right-wing press are going to grow and grow and grow. So he's got his work cut out. It's not going to be easy for him. But my prediction is that sooner rather than later, Andy Burnham will be our 8th Prime Minister, is it? 7th. I've lost count. Is it 7?
Well, it'll be 8 if Pat McFadden gets his month in the sun.
That was, I said, Jim, that it's more likely that to happen than Keir Starmer to hang on for 3 months, you know, kicking his heels in 10 Downing Street. If he does that, then honestly, I will be absolutely amazed. But we wish our next Prime Minister, whoever it is, all the very best, I'm sure. And we'll see how things develop over the next 7 days or so. Now, it's our 149th Downtown Den episode, and we were going to sort of close things down for the summer period and review how we continue the conversations with our audience moving forward. Maybe shorter snippets of conversations with Joe from time to time, Jim, and others. However, we thought to end on 149 would be a bit silly, really. You know, we've got
I know what's coming.
149 out. So we're going to do 150. It won't be next Monday because James is busy. I think he's getting a hair transplant in Turkey. So we look forward to seeing what that looks like. But 150 will be our final episode before the summer recess. And then, as I say, in September, we're going to come back with a slightly different format. But you will still not be able to get away from Joe Phillips, Jim Hancock and myself, because we will be joining you. But as I say, with shorter snippets of views and perhaps responding to things that happen a little more quickly than we've been able to in our weekly podcast series. So stay with us for another week. 150 is coming soon. But in the meantime, have a fantastic 7 days. Thanks for listening. And as ever, have a marvellous downtown week. Thanks, guys.